this incredibly bloated financial sector. It's a phony crisis. They don't have to be cuts. We know how to get out of a Great Depression. You spend money. If we take a look at the typical worker, they're not doing fine.
Hi, I'm Dean Baker. I'm the host of Mostly Economics. Thank you for joining us here today. We have with us Isabella Weber, who's an economist at University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and also has a number of other credentials. I won't go through them all, but she's most well known to many people for her idea of seller's inflation that took on great importance during the pandemic, and as we'll see in a minute, might have continued importance going forward. So thanks for joining us, Isabella.
Thanks so much for having me, Dean. Great pleasure.
So let me start the concept of seller's inflation. I'll have to say a little bit on it and have you explain a little bit more. That we all knew we had the pandemic and the supply chain crisis and obviously a lot of inflation. And sort of the simple Econ 101 was you have inflation because we had shortage of supply, which we clearly did. So that was kind of the simple Econ 101 story. And we had a lot of people running around saying, oh my God, we were so stupid. We had this big increase in demand. And look at this and look at that. And the point, and you could lay it out for us, but the point of seller's inflation, there was more going on. It wasn't just that we had a shortage of supply. So can you say a little bit about what the more going on there was?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of the debate was still kind of demand versus supply-led inflation, right? So the fact that it actually comes from supply shocks was already kind of the first bet, right? So I would say that seller's inflation kind of adds a nuance to the supply-driven inflation story. The idea of seller's inflation actually comes from Abba Lerner's work, and his basic argument was to say that there's nothing asymmetric between wages and profits in the sense that inflation could only be wage-driven. It could also be profit-driven. So it could come from the price-setting behavior of firms. Now, what we did with the work on seller's inflation is to kind of unpack the inflation process and try to understand how it starts and how it's percolated through the system. And what we argue is that there are initial shocks in what we call systemically significant sectors. These are sectors that are more upstream, that have larger implications for the production system as a whole because they provide stuff that goes in everything that we produce. Think of the energy sector, think of agriculture, think of shipping, think of wholesale trade, that kind of stuff. And we had major price explosions in these upstream systemically significant sectors where these prices tend to be very volatile prices. If you look at oil prices, I mean, no one sets the price of oil. Even Exxon doesn't set the price of oil. It's really a supply and demand kind of a price. I mean, someone might have not be keen to increase the supply as fast as they could have, as the FTC found out later. But in any case, it's a supply-demand determined kind of price. So these prices were shooting up as there was low supply in relationship to demand in various of these markets, and we can go through them one by one to understand why this was the case. But the bottom line is prices were shooting up. And with this price explosion, there was a profit explosion. Then the question is, how do these price explosions that present themselves as cost pressure to the rest of the economy, how do firms respond to that, right? Do they absorb some of this? Do they pass it on? Or do they price to at least protect their margins? Now, what we found by studying earnings calls is that firms became more and more confident to do what they call take price on these earnings calls, which is to lean into a strategy that prioritizes increasing prices over securing volumes because they found that this was more profitable. Now, then the question is, of course, why is that the case? Like, why is it that firms are leaning into this taking price kind of strategy? And to study that, we actually did a paper that has just been accepted by a journal and is out as a working paper, where we used AI to study a large number, tens and thousands of earnings calls to show that when cost shocks are occurring across a whole sector, then firms actually perceive it as good news. When cost shocks are individual to any one firm, they perceive it as bad news. In other words, when there is a general increase in costs, there's some sort of implicit coordination effect going on where the people in the large companies that are in charge of pricing, that literally sit down and come up with a pricing strategy, decide and say, well, if our costs are shooting up and the costs of our competitors are shooting up, then the quote unquote natural way to react to this is to increase prices in ways to at least protect profit margins. Now, if firms manage to protect profit margins, even though costs are going up, in some cases quite dramatically, then this means as a matter of basic arithmetics that the unit profits are actually going up. So you have in one part of the economy, say the oil sector is the most iconic, most important example, literal profit explosions. We actually also have done another paper where we trace who benefits from these profit explosions. And in the rest of the economy, you have a corporate sector that by and large has been quite capable, in particular for the very large companies that control and manage the largest part of the economy, to push these cost increases on in ways that protect margins and increase their profits. The flip side of this is that at least in the first instance, the rest of us are picking up these cost explosions, right? So in the first instance, real wages go down because this is not a wage-driven inflation. This is a cost shock-induced sellers inflation. Eventually, workers start fighting back. Eventually, they ask for higher wages, and that's what we saw. So eventually, nominal wages pick up. Eventually, real wages pick up. But this is a wage catch-up. This is a compensation for the lost purchasing power that was a result of these first two stages of sellers inflation, these initial cost explosions, and then the propagation of these cost explosions through the pricing behavior of the rest of the corporate sector, not the origin of this inflation.
Yeah, this is an incredibly important point that, I'll admit I myself was a skeptic originally that, you look, okay, what happens when you have a shortage? And, I'm old enough to remember the 70s where we had the oil embargoes in the early 70s, and then 78, 79, the Iranian Revolution took all this oil off world markets, and price of oil went up. Okay, well, that's what you expect to happen. You suddenly have a shortage. And that is the story here in part. But the point is that you also had firms taking advantage of market power so that they not only kept up with their higher costs, but they actually increased their profits in that context. And again, I was like, people use the terms, I know you never use the term, but a lot of people use the term greedflation. And, again, I'm not going to knock someone for using a term that turned out to be very good politically. But, we all know, okay, corporations are always greedy, so that's not new. But the point was that you had an environment where they could act in a way that allowed them to push up their prices in excess of their costs. And again, as you said, you've done obviously much more research on this than I have, but it's very clear if you just look at the macro data, profit shares increased. And, again, to my surprise, not only did they increase, 22, 23, we were still experiencing the shortage, they're still higher to this day, which, again, I wouldn't have guessed. I don't know what you would have guessed.
Yeah, thanks for bringing this up. I mean, the profit share national income was below 14%, just below 14% is in 2024 still above 16%, right? So that's quite a significant increase in the profit share in a pretty short amount of time. And I think it's important to acknowledge another effect that I didn't get into in my first answer, which is these prices go up with the cost shock, but since oil prices, food commodity prices, all sorts of commodity prices, shipping prices, these are all volatile prices. So they eventually come down, right? But the prices of most of the final goods are actually pretty sticky prices. So these prices go up when the costs go up, but they don't go down when the costs go down. So that you get this like second round of windfalls that are like kind of an afterthought to the earlier process, but that can be quite significant in some cases.
Yeah, no, and it is just worth mentioning that we could look at, I don't know if everywhere, and again, I'm sure you have more data on this, but, oil prices are back to where they were before the pandemic, maybe a little bit lower. Shipping costs are back to where they were before the pandemic. So, again, I don't know if that's true if we go list, but
Yep.
at least those very important sectors, prices have returned to their pre-pandemic levels. So that at least is not a justification for higher prices. Now, there are other factors. Wages, thankfully, have risen. So that is a factor. But yeah, I mean, their profit share is still higher. So I want to
And
ask
we
a
can
little
see
bit.
this quite clearly.
Again,
Like,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
sorry. I mean, we can see this quite clearly if we look, for example, at the food industry, right, where you have pretty clearly partitioned like upstream commodity and parts of the market, and then the more downstream processed food prices. And you can see how the upstream prices like move in a very erratic kind of way, and the downstream prices pretty stable. I mean, they go up when the input costs go up, but don't go down. So this is something that you can plot and look at, and it's pretty persistent pattern across countries and even across time, I would say. But in this case, it was even more extreme than the usual case. I also want to quickly comment on the greedflation question, just because it's been such a salient topic of debate. So, I mean, of course, I'm of the opinion that greed is important under capitalism, and that like companies at the end of the day are pursuing profits. And if you want to use a morally loaded language, you can call this greed, right? But the point is that this greed or this pursuit of profit is basically a constant feature of capitalism, right? Same with corporate concentration, by the way, right? I mean, we have had incredibly high levels of corporate concentration for a pretty long time already. I mean, it's been slowly going up even further, but I mean, there has been a lot of market power around for decades. So you have two things that are pretty structural, like pretty long-term kind of features of the economy that I think by themselves cannot explain sudden changes, right? So the question is like, what changed and what made it possible for these large firms to pursue their greed in new kinds of ways? And that's where we argue that these cost shocks and the coordinating effect that comes from these cost shocks is critical. And of course, bottlenecks, you brought this up, Dean, are also absolutely critical. So wherever bottlenecks occurred, firms actually have tended to not just protect their profit margins, but actually increase profit margins, right? But we are thinking of this as an important but more exceptional case. I mean, we have seen shortages, and when these shortages were in upstream important sectors, like, for example, also computer chips, they had very vast impacts on the rest of the economy. But it's not like we have seen across the board shortages, right? But we have seen across the board increases in prices, and we have seen this across the board increase in the profit share in the national income. And that, I think, requires a more general explanation, which we are trying to get at with this implicit coordination story.
Yeah, no, very, very important. So I wanted to ask a little bit. I know, this is, not the best experience for you, but the response in the profession, and I'm raising this not just in your case. I mean, it's obviously important in your case, but I find it, and I'm sure many others do as well. We're seeing this attack on expertise coming from, the Trump administration and their allies, and it's I'll just say, speaking from my own experience, that it's unfortunately there's some truth to it. I guess I'll say. So there's not truth to it in the sense that vaccines aren't killing people. There's not truth to it in, we do know global warming is happening, even if we can't say the exact case. So there's not truth to it in that sense. But the fact that we have institutionalized hierarchies that don't act as kind of the idealized intellectual community, that's a serious problem. That is a real problem. And you were kind of the brunt of this because you're presenting something that was at odds with the mainstream of the profession at the time. So if I could just get you to say a little bit about the reaction in the profession, again,
Yeah. Absolutely. Let me maybe give a more abstract answer first and then delve into the more concrete story. So I think there's different things going on here, right? On the one hand, I'm actually teaching history of economic thought at UMass, and I always start by discussing the nature of the evolution of economic thinking with my students. And there's this idea that like the evolution of economic thinking is pure scientific progress, right? We have like poor hypotheses to start off, and then we reject the bad hypothesis and we come up with better ones, and we become ever better. And it's wonderful, purely research driven in a kind of vacuum in isolation from any vested interests, class alliances, power dynamics, and so on. Or we can think of the progress in economic thinking as a constant struggle between different ways of approaching the world, between different positionalities, between different class alliances, between different basic ideologies, and not see it as a kind of linear progress that is purely objective, right? And I happen to think that a careful study of the history of thought reveals that the latter is closer to the truth than the earlier explanation. Now, it is, however, the case that if you, for example, look at Milton Friedman's iconic Nobel Prize lecture, that this idea that economics is a science and that it is pure scientific progress is kind of the common mindset in economics, right? So this means that if someone is saying something that diverges from the mainstream, it's very quickly interpreted as this person not being on top of the latest progress, rather than, oh, maybe this person is coming from a different school of thought. Maybe this person has looked at a different set of evidence that we don't look at from the lens that we approach a problem. Maybe this person is pointing out a problem that exists because our trajectory has actually been shaped by the ways in which power plays out, not just in the economics profession, but in society at large. So I think this is the first point. And the second point is, and there's a very substantial literature, empirical literature on this, that there's, of course, an enormous amount of sexism and different, like, discriminatory treatment of women in the economics profession, where if a woman says something, it's perceived very differently than if a man says something. There are all these studies that show that women are treated very differently in seminars in economics and so on, right? So basically, it's not just what you're saying, but it's also who is saying it. So that if you are a woman and if you are someone who comes from a heterodox background and you are saying something that is not aligned with the mainstream position, then the default reaction is kind of, oh, this person is just stupid. She doesn't understand, right? Like she's not on top of the latest scientific evidence. So poor little girl, how did that happen? Sorry for you, right? And if someone who is in a different position, who is at a mainstream institution, who is speaking in a mainstream way, who is in a position of power, who is part of the priesthood and the profession, is saying something similar, it might be perceived as, oh my God, this is like the latest scientific insight that is helping us to progress on this ladder of scientific progress that leads us to ever higher levels of insight, right? And I think that this exact dynamic is what played out when I wrote this op-ed in The Guardian. So I wrote an op-ed, it was like in December 2021, came out in the media dead zone between Christmas and New Year's. I was actually thinking like, okay, probably no one is going to pay attention. I published it on the Guardian US website because the Guardian UK actually had turned it down. Guardian US usually publishes like kind of stuff on culture and politics, not known to be a platform for big economic policy debates. The reason why I published it was because I had been working on my book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy, which came out that year for many years, which is actually a book about inflation and price stability in times of rapid structural change, which was what we were living through with COVID. I mean, we were like going through some sort of an overnight structural change, right? Like suddenly the state decided which factories could operate and which couldn't. States were doing this in an asynchronous way across the world. So like what used to be a very well-geared, very well lubricated clockwork ended up not being in sync anymore and working in ways very different to before the pandemic. So in that sense, we were going through like very rapid structural change. And the closest historical analogy that I thought, and increasingly other people also thought, for that moment was the transition from a war to a post-war economy. Now, of course, like the COVID economy was not the full-blown World War II economy where we had the Office of Price Control, where we had, proper planning for war resourcing and all of that, right? Clearly, that was not the case with the COVID economy. Nevertheless, like the degree of state involvement in the economy over production decisions, even some important consumption decisions, was one that we hadn't seen in a pretty long time. So in that sense, we were transitioning out of a more state-controlled back into a less state-controlled kind of economy. Now, what had happened at the transition from World War II to the post-war period in the United States, which was an episode that the Chinese studied in the 1980s as they were transitioning out of a planned to a market economy, which is why I had been studying China, was that at the time in the United States, economists actually, from people like Paul Samuelson to Frank Knight, the mentor of Milton Friedman, to John Kenneth Galbraith, to one of the most important 20th century institutionalist economists, right, to Paul Sweezy, one of the most important American Marxist economists, they all agreed that in that kind of situation, you would have bottlenecks because it would take time to retool from producing tanks to producing cars, from producing guns to producing refrigerators, and so on. While that retooling happened, demand was already strong because people wanted to buy the stuff that they couldn't have during the war. And these bottlenecks gave companies temporary pricing power that allowed them to increase prices in ways that would result in major windfall profits, and that would result in a short run, transitory, but nonetheless very harmful inflation, because it would basically be an inflation that redistributes from the bottom to the top. Like ordinary people want to have refrigerators. Refrigerator producers are making windfall profits, purchasing power of workers falls, profits of companies rise. So if this is the kind of dynamic that we are looking at, the economists that I just cited at the time that barely agreed on anything, right? But they all agreed that in this kind of situation, temporary targeted price controls for important areas where these kind of bottlenecks could have major systemic implications were a good idea, because they could buy time for the supply adjustment that by definition took time because it takes whatever time it takes to retool. And that these kind of price controls could actually even speed up the retooling, because if the companies were allowed to reap windfall profits from the shortages, then this would mean that they were in no rush to get out of a situation that was granting them windfall profits. But if the amount of profit that they could make per unit of refrigerator or car they produced was capped at a certain level, then they would actually be under much more pressure to increase volumes and get out of the shortage kind of situation.
If I could just emphasize that for a moment. So the argument here is that you're in a shortage situation, so they actually benefit by preserving the shortage. So they have without price controls, they have little incentive to rush to expand capacity because they're benefiting from the shortage. So what you're saying is that if you had price controls, they're not benefiting as much from the shortage. So then they have more incentive to say, okay.
Exactly. The price. Sorry, now I cut out for a moment and I talked over you. I didn't. I couldn't hear you for a second, but I think I got what you were saying. Okay. So basically, if you compare the incentive of increasing volume with or without price control, then the incentive is actually higher if there's a price control, because the amount of unit profit is capped by the price control. So the only way to make more profit is to produce more stuff, which in the other case, as long as there is this shortage and there's strong demand, you can push up prices in pretty extreme ways. So there is a way to increase profits by pushing up prices. So
economists don't like to see the world that way, but yes, it does sometimes end up that way.
Economists don't like to see the world that way, but in these extraordinary circumstances where the supply is constrained by real forces, which could also, for example, be a war, right? Could be a sanction, could be a port that is blocked, could be a natural disaster that cuts off supply lines. In these kind of situations, it can be the case that it simply takes time to fix supply coming back, right? So that allowing a price explosion in that moment can actually have perverse effects that it wouldn't have if supply lines were running as they are intended to run, if ports were running in the ways in which they are intended to run, and so on. So this is a long-winded answer,
more
but
war, older than the pandemic. In I think it was 2001, it would have been. You had California deregulated their electricity prices. And this was the famous Enron story. They deliberately held capacity offline because they realized, hold the capacity offline, you can send prices through the roof. And it turned out, people suspected they were doing that, but they actually found their internal documents, their emails, and they were laughing about it. So it's, it is an analogous situation. There were shortages of electricity for sure, but they were deliberately trying to make those as severe as possible because they could just charge crazy prices.
Yeah, that probably would have been more or less a monopoly supplier, right? Now, what can happen?
Close to that, yeah.
What can happen in situations of such emergencies is that kind of anyone who has inventory or who can provide the service can, for a short amount of time, become some sort of a temporary monopolist. So that this, even though there are several car companies, but every car company can only produce as many cars as they have computer chips. So the supply of cars is strictly limited by the number of computer chips, so that there's no way to outcompete your competitor by taking over their market share by increasing production. So that it's kind of as if you were playing musical chairs and then the music stops and it's just whatever you have, right? For that moment. So that these kind of temporary monopoly effects can result in a similar kind of dynamic that we would otherwise only attribute to a more or less proper monopoly type of situation. Okay, but I'm telling this long-winded story about where I was coming from because I think it's important to say that I didn't just pull out a crazy idea out of my head. No, this was something that I had actually been researching for years. That if you go back to the history of thought on this, there's a very salient episode that I've grounded my argument in and so on. In any case, it was then interpreted as crazy young economist calling for total price freeze, Nixon style or something, right? So then this massive hate storm happened on social media, which interestingly, and most people don't realize this, was actually started by very far-right groups, some of them from Latin America, Bolsonaro supporters, far-right folks from Venezuela, then the cryptocurrency community, people with huge accounts and Hitler and crypto in their handle that I had never heard of. And then this way, through this far-right hate storm, my op-ed was propped up on Twitter in ways that it became very salient and appeared on everybody's timeline because it got so much engagement. So then actually the economists also started to engage. Initially it was just all sorts of economists making fun of me. I mean, the cute comments were did she find her PhD in a box of cornflakes? These were the friendly ones. So you can imagine what the non-friendly ones were. And then it culminated when Paul Krugman intervened and tweeted, "I'm not a free market salad, but this is truly stupid," quote tweeting my op-ed. He later apologized, in contrast to thousands of people who never apologized, some of whom also not exactly unknown entities. So I really want to give him credit for that. But what happened after he made that statement is that it really opened up the floodgates of hate. So, I was already in this disadvantaged position of being a relatively unknown at the time. When my book had actually done pretty well, it was in the Financial Times list of books of the summer and so on. So, I was kind of an up-and-coming scholar, but not a widely known economist. And so with this intervention of someone who, as a Nobel Memorial Prize winner, of course, has the highest authority in the discipline that you can imagine, basically said, okay, anyone can shoot at her, right? And that's what people did. And the story, of course, doesn't stop here. Then, it evolved on. A lot of the accusations that were less ridiculous than the cornflakes box were nonetheless typically misconstrued, in the sense that most people didn't read carefully what I had actually written, but were misattributing all sorts of absurd claims about total price controls. I don't know. The worst one was probably Noah Smith putting aggregate supply and demand curves in a supply and demand diagram and then putting a price ceiling on top of it, which had nothing to do with what I had been arguing, which was to surgically intervene and try to come up with price stabilization policies in critical sectors where temporary shortages let prices explode in ways that could not be fixed in the very short run, but where you would need a price intervention and then a supply side intervention to basically contain the damage as locally as possible, instead of letting it explode and then ripple through the whole system. Now, again, this is a kind of along the lines of power in the profession, priesthood, and so on. Stephanie Kelton, someone whom I had actually never interacted with before, didn't know before. I haven't been an MMT person or anything like that. She watched all of this happen, and she reached out to James Galbraith and asked Jamie, do you know Isabella? Because Jamie had actually endorsed my book. And Jamie then wrote a Twitter thread, he's not on Twitter himself, that Stephanie posted on his behalf, that basically resurrected my seriousness as a scholar and as a researcher, that recounted all the accolades that I had won for the book, the important contribution that the book had made on questions of price policy and so on. And that was actually the thing then that started to change the dynamic. So I think if it hadn't been for that intervention, which basically gave a whole bunch of people cover to start supporting me, I'm not sure if it had come to the point that Krugman would have apologized. So again,
I know about Stephanie and Jamie, they're friends, and Stephanie was already on shoot. In fact, the first segment of this, and I had not known that specifics. That's a very interesting story.
Yeah, most people leave that out, but I think it's really important to give credit to Stephanie here, because she really acted like someone, if you go to an elementary school training on civil carriage, right? We would expect kids that see another kid being beaten up on the schoolyard to go and call that out and go call for help, right? But basically, no one did this. Like, everybody just became either bystanders or joining the mob, right? And Stephanie was the one who actually, without knowing me, without any prior personal connection whatsoever, intervened and reached out to Jamie and came up with a plan to give me help, right? And I'm telling this in such detail because I think that there's a very important lesson in here, which is that if we see things like that happen, it's important to speak out. It's important to provide support, because the person who is under attack at that moment loses their voice, right? There were some people who were calling out the tone, saying no one should be called these names, no one should be treated like this. But also what she's saying really doesn't make any sense, which, in this kind of situation, is an utterly unhelpful intervention. At this point, it's no longer about whether you agree with price controls, whether you agree with this specific argument that I was making, whether you agree with the surgical approach that I was advocating as an alternative path to Larry Summers' interest rate hammer that would throw millions of people out of work. It's really about what is happening here in terms of the power dynamic, and how is a person literally being subjected to a public mob. And that, I think, is a really important insight. Not least in the word of Trump, in the word of nascent forms of fascism, proto-fascism, far-right extremism, whatever you want to call it, the question of how to be an ally when someone is under serious attack.
So I just wanted to say that not only, you're exactly right that, of course, your argument should have been treated as serious arguments. People could disagree with it. The point was they were serious arguments. They weren't being treated as serious arguments. But thankfully, people did start to treat them as serious arguments. And, as you said, you were been cited in OECD, the IMF, and I remember both then Secretary Janet Yellen and Yellen Brainer, the head of President Biden's National Economic Council, both basically were speaking in the same terms about the inflation that we saw in the pandemic. So it was, they become widely accepted. I'm not saying everyone totally agrees with them, but they are now widely accepted. I'll just mention one other thing, going the other direction, that where you've had mainstream economists that made serious mistakes, and your colleagues at the University of Massachusetts exposed this. Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff, who were both very prominent named chairs at Harvard University, did a famous paper back in, I believe it was 2010, that purported to show that when a country's debt to GDP ratio exceeded 90%, that its economy slowed sharply. It's sharply slower growth. So this became a very important paper. It was widely cited by central ministers, members of parliament, members of Congress, and it turned out to be wrong. It was driven by an Excel spreadsheet, which is kind of unbelievable. And it turned out that there was basically no basis for this at all. And what was striking, their comment when it was exposed, they got very angry. They were attacking the people who exposed it. Again, these are Isabella's colleagues at the University of Massachusetts, that they're Marxist. Literally, they were saying this, which, it wasn't true, but even if it was. We're talking about arithmetic. It doesn't matter whether you're a Marxist, it's the same arithmetic. But they attacked them, and they acknowledged it was a mistake. What could they do? You did it correctly. But what was striking was they suffered no professional consequence for that. They're both named chairs at Harvard. And I've raised this with people. They go, what do you want? You want them to be fired? Well, I don't know if I necessarily want them to be fired, but I'd like to see them suffer some professional consequence, because this was really serious. And, their explanation that it was an Excel spreadsheet here, there was a seminar paper. That was true. They were giving it at a conference, and they were rushed to finish it. We've all been in that boat. I made mistakes. It's unfortunate. I try to avoid it, but it happens. It's unfortunate. But the point was, they knew that this paper was being used as the basis for policy in countries around the world. So you knew that you had rushed to do this as a seminar paper. Couldn't you have subsequently checked? And again, they're both named chaired at Harvard. There's no shortage of graduate students. They could have just said, hey, can you check this over, make sure it's right? They never bothered to do that. And that's, to my view, that's a very, very serious failure of professional ethics. And again, to my knowledge, they suffered no consequence. They were embarrassed by it. I know Colbert had a segment with the lead author on that. It was a grad student, and he made fun of him, made fun of Rogoff and Reinhardt. But, in terms of the profession, they, as say, apart from being embarrassed about their paper, they suffered no consequence. So,
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a very important point. And it again, that goes to the point of that there is a very clear power dynamic that is at pretty obvious odds with the idea that we are just going through scientific progress in some sort of a vacuum in an objective kind of way, right? I think in my case, as you were saying, as 2022 evolved and the Russian attack on Ukraine happened and the energy price explosions became ever worse, then actually suddenly even the idea of price controls became a pretty palatable one, right? I remember very clearly in summer 2022 when Paul Krugman actually came out with an op-ed in which he argued for war economy style measures in Europe, not just price controls, but he even called for rationing. And then, by the fall of 2022, I found myself on a commission advising the German government on gas price stabilization, because these price shocks just became so gigantic that it was impossible for both firms and consumers to absorb that kind of shock, right? And as you say, I mean, beyond the specific case of the German and the European energy crisis, there was a lot of pickup by not just academics, but also policymakers. There's a speech by Christine Lagarde, I'd say it was summer, maybe June 2022, where she's talking about the stages of the inflation process in ways that literally sound like she's quoting my paper. I mean, she never quoted my paper, but the head of the European Central Bank. But the logic that she's spelling out is just exactly the logic that I had been going for months. And a lot of empirical evidence also came out, as we already hinted at, right, that there in fact has been an increase in the overall profit share now, and also that if we do the GDP deflator decompositions, that very unusually large shares go to profits compared to the inflation of the 1970s, for example. I mean, these studies have mainly been on the European case, but I don't think that the European case is exceptional here. This is something that, for example, the IMF acknowledged for the European case.
I wanted to give you a chance. We talked at the beginning that you wanted to talk about tariffs. I want to talk about tariffs too, because that's kind of the big issue that's in front of us. So I wanted to give you a little chance to talk about that. So here we have, and I guess, it changes by the day, so we don't know exactly what we're looking at, but odds are pretty big tariff increases. Whether they stay where they are today, they'll be lower in a month. Yeah, no one knows. But in any case, we're looking at pretty big tariff increases. So what do you think is likely outcomes from, at least given what we know today about the tariffs?
Yeah, so, I mean, one of the funny things is that now suddenly all economists seem to agree that the tariffs are inflationary, right? And the tariffs are, of course, like a massive cost shock. I think it's also interesting how there hasn't been more corporate resistance to the tariffs in the run-up to Liberation Day. I think that the corporate world has really, on the one hand, underestimated just how brutal the tariff intervention will be, but on the other hand, might also have gone into this based on the experience of sellers inflation, based on the experience that for a lot of large companies, a bit of a surgical cost shock was actually pretty good for their bottom line, so that they might have been quite confident that they can pass this on in ways that wouldn't harm them in any kind of substantial way. Now, they didn't anticipate the kind of massive explosion tariffs that we have seen. And I think that matters in the sense that, of course, if volumes decline too much, then you can get into a territory where even if you can increase prices by a lot, you nevertheless lose out in terms of your bottom line, right? And I think that for many companies, that territory is pretty real, like is kind of ahead of them. But I will also say that in terms of corporate concentration and the effects that all of this will have on the structure of the economy, it's, from where I sit, quite likely that large, powerful corporations will be doing much better than smaller corporations for several reasons. The first reason is that, of course, we are here in the first instance not dealing with a shortage that is the result of a blocked port or something like this, but we are dealing potentially with shortages that come from costs just being too high that it's still worth importing that stuff. So this then means, like, who has the best cost management to prevent such shortages? Translating this into more real world language, the question is, what is the power position of the company buying from their suppliers? And if you are Walmart, your ability to squeeze your Chinese supplier to the very edge and make Chinese workers absorb the tariffs as much as possible, who are already not living a particularly appealing standard of living, right? Like, squeeze them further. That's what a Walmart can do. But if you are a small corner store and you used to rely on the de minimis mail services, right? You didn't even pay any tariffs before. and you are just like one out of thousands of customers of a supplier of whatever the product is, like your ability to push back and try to share the cost burden of tariffs with your supplier is completely non-existent, right? So that's the first point. And I'm not saying that Walmart can squeeze Chinese suppliers for everything to a point where it still makes sense, but for a range of products, they might well be, right? And I'm just using Walmart as an example here. And small companies can't do that. Another reason for the power asymmetry in dealing with this shock is access to bank credits and generally access to finance, right? Like if you are a very small store, like your ability to even buy inventory on credit is much more limited than if you are a big company, let alone access to other forms of capital from financial markets, right? That is to say that your ability to build up inventories and prepare for the storm has been much more limited in the first place. And then your ability to absorb the storm is even more limited, right? So this is to say that the ones that are likely to go under in all of this are the smaller players, not the larger players, so that the result of all of this could be an increase in corporate concentration from already enormously high levels of corporate concentration. So that on top of shortages and inflation, that I think is very much in the pipeline and is probably going to hit unless something magical happens at the meeting in Switzerland that is just that has just been announced between China and the U.S. I mean, it's likely to hit in a couple of months, right? And a lot of the examples that we have seen is a kind of, the only companies that can produce doll hair are in China. Like there's not a single company in the US that can produce doll hairs. Oh, how curious, how weird. Now we will have dolls without hair for Christmas, which I mean is hilarious and quirky and whatever. And I get it that it makes for a good story and people will click on it. But that's not the real problem we are dealing with, right? The real problem we are dealing with is that anything that has electronics in it, for example, will likely not be available in the abundance that we are used to, is likely to run into shortages. This can be totally trivial things that no one really needs, but it can also be stuff like fans and air conditioners that if you are in a situation where your house is overheating, could be a pretty existential supply. If your water heater breaks down, that's the kind of thing that you might not have access to. If you are poor and you don't have a proper kitchen, and all that you have is a microwave, and your microwave breaks down, and you can't get a new microwave, then these are like not luxury problems. This is not like having an ugly doll. This actually starts being like really painful on top of the simple like pressure on purchasing power that is already likely to come from this inflation, right? So we are talking both shortages in essentials and loss of purchasing power for the majority of Americans who supposedly were meant to be protected by this mad tariff onslaught, right? Now, another aspect that I think we don't look at enough is that a pretty substantial share of the imports from China are actually intermediate goods, right? So it's not like this is just stopping Chinese factories from being able to access the American market.
Supply chains, kind of like what we had with COVID, except for
Exactly,
doing it.
Exactly. It's like yes, it's like self-inflicted rerun of what we had with COVID. And then the question, of course, becomes like, why on earth is this happening? And I mean, there has been a lot of speculation around that. And I think that it's very hard to justify it with only economic rationales. I mean, even what I said in terms of not enough resistance from corporations, I'm not suggesting that this is a kind of a big business conspiracy to erase small business. I think it's way too risky, way too dangerous, way too much of like kind of a wildfire that could go in any direction for this to be the strategy behind this. But what one can see is that the Trump administration is relying on igniting chaos in all sorts of realms of our lives. And that creating chaos is like kind of part of their strategy, right? Creating chaos and creating general threats that people and companies and countries then have to come back to Trump and back for exceptions and pledge loyalty and favors in turn. So I'm thinking of this like a bit like the mafia method, like how the mafia puts like a general threat of if you don't play along, like we will smash your windows first, then you might find a dead horse head on your car seat, and then like it gradually escalates. So there's like a general threat that is put on everybody's head, makes everybody kind of comply and try to curry favor and be on the good side and pledge loyalty and so on, right?
And I've been sympathetic in years past to the idea that we did want to increase our manufacturing production, and partly there used to be a manufacturing wage premium. There's not anymore. So I'm less sympathetic to that. But one of the things that, I and others who felt that was something that would be good, I thought the best way to do that was to lower the value of the dollar, which has the same impact in terms of making us relatively more competitive as a tariff does, but it doesn't open the door for corruption. So simple logic, I won't go through all the details. If the dollar were to fall by 20%, it in effect makes our goods 20% cheaper relative to European, Chinese. The real world's more complicated, but it's similar to putting a 20% tariff on, but there's no one to pay off.
I fully understand that is a problem that the US has been deindustrialized. But I think to think about industrialization and reindustrialization, it's not enough to just adjust relative prices. It requires very comprehensive industrial policy that takes the different time frames and the real structures of supply chains into account, right? And ask the question, what can reasonably be brought back rather than like smashing everything around us?
And toys.
Exactly. I mean, there are some things that thank God that we don't have to do that anymore. I also think like as a vision for the future of this country, like suggesting that, there was this moment when Besant went on TV and said like, then Americans can screw little screws on iPhones again, right? The irony of this was just so blatant that it kind of revealed that, if the whole vision for the future is to go back to long shifts in the factory, that this is like somehow not enough and that there's a reason that the Chinese are actually trying to upgrade and no longer have their working class spend 12-hour shifts in Foxconn factories where the suicide rate is amongst the highest in the context of Chinese workers, right? Then I think it's pretty clear that we need to somehow do better than just say, okay, let's send people back to the factory as the solution by itself. It can be part of the solution, but I don't think it's by itself enough of a solution.
I will just add one other point, because we were talking about you raised the issue about how we have to think about supply chains and everything. We could all go through Biden, what were the pluses, what were the minuses, but there was a huge boom in factory construction. I've raised this with people and they just like, where are you getting that? I go, it's the national income and product accounts. This is government data, Bureau of Economic Analysis. I don't know if anybody really questions it. We saw factory construction double, real value, adjusted for inflation, double from 2019 to 2024. So to my view, that was a big deal. And this was deliberate. It was, the CHIPS Act, it was the Infrastructure Bill, it was the Inflation Reduction Act. The idea was we targeted certain sectors. You can argue whether those were the best sectors, but it did what it was intended to do. So, again, could you have done it better, differently? Sure. But we actually did do that. Thanks a lot for coming on, Isabella. Really appreciate it. And I know you have a lot more to say. I'm enjoying it, but I don't want to take up your time. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you like what you just saw, please help us out by liking us and subscribing. Thank you.